back to this room where he's been a teacher before and going to be a teacher again tonight. I mean, basically, the thought about Alejandro is exactly that he's an architect, and architects are a strange species, and there are lots of subspecies. But one of those species, the one that is the most interesting, I think, are the thoughtful architects, right? You know, like kind of serious and thinking and making work that thinks. And of course, it helps to be trained in Spain. It's a good way to start thinking. But I think the first symptom, which was so interesting, very, very early, you were doing these interviews with architects. So in all of these interviews, I think the people you were interviewing felt flattered because you were going to publish them in El Croquis, so they were going to get their face photographed so close that you could see every follicle. They were going to be big and famous and high resolution, and all of their projects would be beautifully rendered in black on white, everything kind of religious ceremony of acceptance. But then you'd meet this nice young architect who would just do this interview, but the interview would turn out to be a kind of anthropological study of the species of architects. So basically the collection of interviews became a kind of anthropology of the architect. It's as if Alejandro was doing that to sort of understand how his own practice might operate, and the practice got underway. And FOA was annoyed every single architect on the planet because they did a hugely, enormously interesting project when they were very young, and that's not supposed to happen. So everybody smiled and said it was a beautiful project, but they really hated these guys for doing this. They wouldn't have been even happy if they did it in their 40s, but it was really, really early. And this gave a kind of momentum to the office and to the thinking, and allowed them to kind of bypass a lot of wasted years, it seems to me. And FOA was an incredibly strong office. Again, the thoughtfulness came back with a kind of sideways move into running a unit at the AA for 8 or 9 years. And if you know the AA running a unit, that's religion. You know, you have your own religion. And so 8 years of religion, you get to work through a lot of ideas very, very closely with students who only want to work with you on that and be part of that religion. Then he kind of, you know, got promiscuous and started to teach at Columbia and Yale and Princeton, the whole American thing. And that seemed to be a rehearsal for the position at Princeton, where you're now the dean, taking care of a school. All these things are kind of layered up. Meanwhile, the practice keeps going. The practice continues to annoy people, in this case by refusing to have only 3 letters, like AZPML. It's just one more letter than anyone else, and it's getting people thinking. And then, of course, in the same moment that you took over the school, the Sniper's Log came out as a kind of manifesto for Generation X. So as if the youthfulness of the early, the youth thing was still a big issue for you. So I guess the point, what I'm trying to say is this: it's a very interesting map. If you make a map of how this architect has formed himself, and it seems to me architects do that. It's the first and biggest project they do, to design themselves, to craft it, to shape it, and so on. This all ends up with a kind of refusal of any simple distinction between the work on the projects and the work in writing. In studios and lectures and projects and publications, there's normally a very, very particular question being worked through, and for quite some time now that question has been the envelope, like not the inside of the building nor the outside of the building, but what is in between. That went from being, even here there were studios and lectures, and it's really like a full-on obsession. So I think you're very lucky tonight to hear a very thoughtful architect that's basically been thinking about only one thing for a long time. And I think it's an entirely a privilege for us to hear that and to tune into it and hear the latest move on this. And I can't help but comment on the fact that you are presented as a historian. And just for the record, I think that's correct. That's right. That history is an art form. It's constructed. It's a very active construction, and it's not simply isolated. It's actually a form of practice. And if you look at the practice of Zaera-Polo, you'll see has been always operating as a historian, and not by chance the kind of Rainer Banham's 4 ecologies gets updated to 12 ecologies proving again that you can also annoy people who are dead, and that seems to me a really honourable mission. Anyway, in the hope that you could be truly annoying one more time and produce a kind of residual jealousy that just a sort of resentment is, this could be a very sad introduction. It could well be that one of the organizing emotions in our field is resentment in a positive sense. Like, you know, why is that person doing that? And that's driving me to do this, which is driving that. So actually you could say that architects are not very kind to each other in general, that somehow society doesn't treat the architect with a lot of dignity, and as a result, like in a game of Survivor, architects eat architects, and so there's a kind of internal resentment. And some people turn that into incredibly productive work, and I think it's one of the trademarks of you as a person and of your work, that you have actually taken this study of the architect as a species to turn yourself into a species that thinks, and that species might well be that of a historian. Alejandro.
Well, thank you very much, Mark, for this new invitation to be back here, where I did the first public presentation of the envelope maybe 6 years ago or something like that. And so what I think about this new invitation is that you invited me sponsored by some sort of society or company that does ornamentation in facades, etc. And maybe that was the opportunity or the reason why you asked me to come back and talk about the the envelope. And what happened was that obviously since the last time I presented this here, it has evolved, it has been published, etc., and it keeps evolving. And this latest iteration of this project came about an invitation to be part of the next Biennale, where I'm supposed to do something about the facade, and that question has now triggered a new phase of this research, which I am very excited about, but I have to admit that this at the very beginning. And I thought that maybe since the last time it was also the first public presentation of the subject, it was pertinent that this time I do exactly the same, and I present something that is maybe half-cooked, something that it will change in the future. And maybe we use this opportunity to discuss it and to question this problem. So the particularity about this iteration of the research is that it's not a research based on my own practice like last time, simply because the issues that interest me now about the subject cannot be contained in my own practice, and this is why I had to devise a different way of working, and that's why maybe a little bit jokingly I say I'm coming here tonight as a historian, but there is something true about it, as you say. There is the fact that rather than trying to explain something that you originate and that you try to in a way present as an original work, you enter into trends, you enter into movements that are already there. You enter a field that is in a way already populated by many others that are doing things. And in some ways what I want to do today, I'm not going to be talking about the work of the office, but I mean, maybe I will have introduced some projects of the office, but simply as a sample that at some point I was part of one of these trends. But the work is the work more of a historian, except that obviously I'm not a proper historian. I don't, for example, I don't have critical distance, and maybe one of the things that that you need to question or you question when you enter into this field as an architect is what is the relevance of the critical distance, whether you can perhaps practice as a historian without that distance, and maybe as a way of interpreting data in order to support a certain proposal that do not pretend to have that distance, but pretend to reorganize the data in order to project this data in a certain direction. So basically, what I'm trying to do, perhaps paraphrasing the evolutionary theorist Daniel Dennett, is to redefine the design space of the facade or the envelope of the contemporary envelope, and so it's more to see what. I am interested in this notion of the design space because it's almost as if architects invent what they are. They come, they invent something from scratch, they put it forward, but actually what I think is important also for an architect to be operating as a historian temporarily is that you are entering a field that is already defined. There are certain things that you can do and certain things that you cannot do, that they are outside the design space. And that design space is the one that I think can be constructed or explained through data that is perhaps not your own work, and the purpose of this exercise. The overall purpose of the lecture, and let me see if I can make this move. It doesn't seem to be moving to the next slide. How should I do it? Let's see if this one works. Okay, so I mean the purpose, the general purpose of this is the same purpose as the previous iteration, which is to think that the theory of the facade, the architectural theory of the facade, is somehow outdated. It has been in crisis for a long time. I would almost say that there hasn't been anything said in this field that is relevant since almost the 20s or the 30s. Maybe I'm exaggerating, but in some ways, what the whole project of the envelope came as a result of thinking that the existing theories were not effective at dealing with the notion of the facade or helping to think the facade. It is primarily because they depart from the idea that the facade of the building is two-dimensional, is an interface between two things, and it is basically about problems of representation and interface and maybe language. And I would like to put forward, and I've already tried to do that in the previous iteration, is that, but more so in this new iteration, is that this plane, which is the facade of the building, or the envelope of the building, is not so much any longer a two-dimensional interface, but is a space, construct that is a literal embodiment of processes. So it's not as if this is mediating between inside and outside or public and private. That is also there, but is what is more interesting about the current status, and I believe the reason why the notion of the facade has entered in crisis, or has been in crisis for a long time, is that element in itself has become material entanglement of things that come together and that embody other sets of cultural, technical, political processes that become encapsulated, become crystallized in this construct, which is the envelope. So what is, I think, effective about thinking about the envelope or the facade like that is that it enables us probably to operate much more effectively in a practice that where products, for example, are readily available and you don't have to invent them, and in fact you cannot invent them from scratch. So there is a whole arsenal of things that you are also entering into that you need to be able to mobilize in order to produce ideas, and those also define this contemporary design space. I think this idea, and particularly what I am starting today, or what I am presenting today, has also the intention of analyzing these things in a very physical way. So I'm particularly interested in the physicality of the architectural of architecture in general, but I believe that again the physicality of architecture has been usually formulated in terms of phenomenological effects, tectonic arguments, but I believe that this different way of understanding the envelope opens a certain materiality that is cannot be reduced to phenomenal effects. And in fact, I think this is maybe one of the problems that this analysis produces or puts forward, because it is a type of materiality that is deeply material, but is not even restricted to the materials that constitute the facade. So we are talking also about air, we are talking about water, we are talking about climate, and all these other materials that exceed the strict materiality of the envelope are also part of this construct that I wouldn't say that is not tectonic, but it's certainly not tectonic in the sense that we have discussed the tectonics of a facade before. Maybe it's about microtectonics. I don't know, but this is certainly one of the questions that this new formulation brings forward. So the idea is to try to analyze these technologies of the envelope, and by that I probably refer to technologies that have evolved basically during the 20th century. There is not much point in going further, so there is also a certain bracket of time that I'm interested in, which starts perhaps at the end of the 19th century in most cases and gets to now, where the range of physical possibilities of building an envelope become so complex and so varied because of simply the technical possibilities of operating like an architect. Sorry, I've lost track there. The new technical possibilities to build envelopes in the last century have become so powerful that I think in some ways have made impossible or invalid whatever happened before. And I'm going to show you to give you a small hint about this. a number of photographs that I've got from a facade contractor. I have to say also one more thing before I get into this, which is that once that idea was formulated, I've been then working with specialists, particularly with one person that I would like to mention. His name is Ignacio Fernandez, and he's an architect but works as a facade specialist in ARUP in Madrid, and has been absolutely crucial to this research. But so what I wanted to show you in this series of images are photographs that in the development of this research, I've received from this company that makes facades. It doesn't matter, but what I think is interesting about these photographs is that you have a mock-up of the facade and a rendering of the building that is where the facade is going to be applied. And I think that the difference in quality between the mock-up and the building is enormous. The mock-ups are all incredibly well-crafted, sophisticated. They actually show that there have been serious research and knowledge applied, and instead what we do, what architects tend to concentrate on, which is to design the facade in the traditional sense, is, I think, not totally uninteresting, but much less interesting. The buildings cannot be seen very, very well, but I think that maybe it's because I'm an architect, and I'm much more judgmental about some of those buildings where these things are to be deployed, and I don't quite understand what is happening here as well as the people who have thought these things. But I think it is an incredible realization that these objects somehow seem to be much more intense and much more interesting than what we architects can do when we draw or when we design a facade. For example, this is a famous facade, the Seagram building, as you know, and what you see here is when we are drawing this facade, we make the detail of the facade with these lines, vertical lines that represent the mullions, but actually this is what goes on in between these two lines. And in here, there are cold bridges, there are gaskets, there are drainage channels, there are all kinds of devices that affect the way the facade transmits light, transmits thermal heat, etc., etc. And I think that this is where the real problem of the envelope lies. And I think that I'm surprised nobody has made yet a history of the mullion. And I mean, maybe that will be one of the things that somebody has to do, to analyze all these bits of plastic and wood and aluminium and folds that generate these incredibly sophisticated things that architects don't understand, generally speaking. So this is, I think, very much the question that originates this investigation. So what we have been doing, because I've been, as I said, working with other people on this, is to try to organize the technologies of making the envelope into now 12 assemblages, 12 material assemblages, and I don't know whether those are precise. Maybe some of you will have ideas about these assemblages, but try to, in some ways, classify or create a new discipline of the envelope that departs from those material assemblages where political, geopolitical, technological, energetic, climatic issues are literally embedded. So this, and in some ways, you know, I'm showing some of these images. The idea would be that you never get to see the whole building, because the really interesting field where we can work today is perhaps in those details of mullions or pieces of glass and steel and wood coming together in a particular way, and we need to somehow generate a critical background where we can discuss those assemblages. I don't think I'm going to have time to go through the 12 environments or the 12 ecologies of the envelope, because maybe there is too much material to explain here, but I will explain maybe a few of them, and then maybe it's more interesting if we discuss the others. But I would like to simply go through them very quickly now, name them, so that you know what are the different technologies, the different assemblages that we are identifying. The first one is obviously the curtain wall, which is the kind of modern facade by excellence. The second one is precast concrete. That is another type of technology that I think is very specific and mobilizes and has certain agencies. Third one has to do, it's called breathless, but it refers to assemblages, and maybe there are more than one assemblage in this technology, because there are different technologies that we can use to produce envelopes that do not breathe, that are as sealed as possible. Watertight assemblages or phase sealed envelopes. Those are envelopes that do not allow, perhaps they allow air leakage, but try to stop the water on the face of the building. So you can already start seeing what are the subjects that are going to be embedded into these dynamics. The movement of water, the movement of air, ventilation, respiration, breathing, and all these agencies that I think involve many other processes. Another one that is screens, rain screens, sun screens, but also masks. Representation has not disappeared, but it has to play in a more complex world. Insulation, the problem of thermal conduction as a very specific problem that produces a whole range of technologies and mobilizes a whole range of technologies. Total vision, the all-glass envelope. I mean, this is a very contemporary and well-known case of this. Double glazing, climate incorporated, so facades that use climate as a material that works within the material. So you have air circulation, temperature changes embedded in the envelope itself. Textile facades, envelopes that are stretched on a frame, and they are stretched sometimes like this one, simply by what is called exotension, but also, for example, ETFE cushions are also stretched type of envelopes, and they are endotension, as the technicians say. Media, so there are a number of facades that now contain also bytes of information, and there are certain technologies that enable to produce certain effects with those technologies. Greenwashing, vegetated facades. So there is another material that now is often incorporated in the envelope, which is plants that, that grow inside these envelopes, and finally kinetic devices, facades that move. Now, I don't know, I wouldn't like to go on for too long, so I think probably I will go through a brief description of half of these things, and then we can perhaps discuss the basis of the research, and maybe difficult to get detailed comments with the level of information that you're going to get, but maybe somebody has interesting suggestions about this proposal. We are going to start with, and the way I'm going to be presenting it, and this is very much the way I've been constructing it, is by generating these micro-histories for every one of these material assemblages. So the idea is to describe this history so that it helps us to understand where we are now and where may this material assemblage move on from now. The most interesting thing about, or not, I don't know whether the most interesting, but one of the most interesting things about the curtain wall, which is obviously the modern facade, the most paradigmatic modern facade, is that it's generally made with the most artificial materials, the two materials that contain most embedded energy. You will see also through the research the appearance of parameters. This one is megajoules per kilo of material, but there will be U values. There will be a whole range of almost a parametric design that doesn't have geometric immediate translation. But I think that once you get into this analysis of the assemblages become important. So aluminium and steel and glass are probably the most artificial materials, the ones that require more energy in order to come to produce them, and those are the ones that constitute this assemblage, which basically I think that we had several discussions. There is this idea that this assemblage is about transparency, and it is about transparency, but I think that more than anything it is an assemblage that is about production. It's about the project of constructing the world from scratch, constructing the modern world from scratch with this kind of transparent envelope. But there is a lot of concentration in the possibility of producing, industrializing these technologies that start probably 1914, 1926, Gropius, Gideon, in a very conceptual way. And I forgot to say something else, which I think maybe I should mention now, particularly in this chapter, which is that the type of history that I am interested in constructing is not a history of firsts. That is not a history that is, I think, relevant to this analysis of the envelope. Is a history of mosts, and you know, this is again a reference to Banham versus mechanization text command, where there is the idea that the history is made by the first who organizes this. I'm not so interested in the first. I'm interested in analyzing these assemblages as almost latent creatures that are suddenly triggered into a dominant species, or that they decay and disappear sometimes, but do not work. I mean, whether you are the first or the last in using them is irrelevant. What is relevant is that that they are embedded into a much more complex ecology of things. So in this case, though the beginning of the assemblage is very conceptual, is very arty, is heavily promoted by Gideon through magazines and Gropius through magazines with this kind of idea of the new world. There are a number of buildings in Europe that explore this idea, even if in reality those are not true curtain walls. They are slightly fake, but they have this impression that they are all made in glass material. This is the Daily Mail. So this is what happens in Europe. What happens here is something completely different. That guy there, and you will see a number of guys, because the other thing that happens when you look at the envelopes in this way is that you discover a different history of architecture with heroes and villains that are not the usual ones, but that are new guys who are more kind of assemblers that are able to understand what do you have to bring together into one of these envelopes rather than designers, which is what the conventional history of architecture has given priority to. And Albert Kahn is one of these guys. He's a guy who built millions of square meters of factories in the Midwest, more or less when Gropius was building this kind of cute little jewels in Europe, using very much the same technology of glass and steel mullions. The Red Rouge factory, the Dodge truck factory in Detroit also. Very interesting, and this is something that is recurrent. It's a recurrent theme in this research, is that some of these factories were built to feed the military industry, and Albert Kahn started to build them just before the Great Depression. Just before the Great Depression, he starts doing things in Detroit, and then the Great Depression happens, and basically all the economic activity of the country moves to the Rust Belt, moves to the Midwest. That's where things are getting built. Things are not getting built in New York because Wall Street is bust, and so what happens is that he suddenly gets this incredible opportunity to build enormous amounts of work using this technology. So depression and war, those are some of the political issues that are in the background of this development here in America. This is another hero of this assemblage, Pietro Venucci, who some of you may have heard, but I also had heard about him, but I always thought he was a really bad second-class architect doing provincial work. But actually, when you start reading his life, you will see that he comes back again and again in different incarnations and manages to be central in the development of these technologies through the century. He is working in Portland, and he builds that building there, which is, I think, the first canonical iteration of the curtain wall as we know it. The full canonical embodiment of the curtain wall is the equitable building, a building that is incredibly sophisticated, has double glazing, is using extruded aluminum that is actually provided by the recycling of the war industry. So that building is finished in 1948. when this huge industry that Albercan was feeding has to readjust. And so basically he puts together this building and then decides to become an academic, becomes the dean of MIT, and sells his practice to nobody else but Skidmore, Owings and Merrill. So in 1948 he finishes that building, sells all his technology, which has to do with double glazing, mullions, extruded aluminum as a technology, heat pumps. This building had geothermal ground source, heating facilities. I mean, an incredible, that building is an incredible feat of technological advance that then is sold to Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, who gets the commission of building Lever House. And they get the commission from this guy, who is Charles Luckman, an architect by training. And I think I mean, this is where I started to feel a historian, because I never worked like this before. But actually, I felt myself feeling incredibly excited about discovering these strange relationships of people having done different things, not because they help perhaps to design the buildings, but because they explain a whole set of relationships happening in the background. So Charles Luckman was an architect, was made the head of Unilever America just at the moment when the war has finished and Wall Street is about to come back, and he sees that it's about to come back, and says, I'm going to make a big move and put my headquarters in Manhattan again to connect to Wall Street, and commissions the building to Skidmore, Owings and Merrill that is obviously reusing the technologies that Belusky had developed in the Equitable. And so one of the, maybe, when I was talking to Ignacio, who is this person with whom I am working, he said, this is the really first canonical curtain wall building, and it is so because it's the first one that is totally sealed and has a device that cleans the building. Equitable didn't have a cleaning device, but Lever House has a cleaning device because Lever sold soap. So Charles Luckman had to make a point out of cleaning the building and having a shiny building in the center of Manhattan. So that is 4 years after the Equitable. Wallace Harrison UN building, another 4 years after, another iteration of, and then you see that basically the recovery has happened, and Manhattan is again a place to build, and by the moment in which that happens, basically the curtain wall has become the technology that everybody has to use to locate themselves in the city. They commission extravagant European architects to do buildings that actually work much worse, technically speaking, than the Equitable building, like Lever House. Lever House is another building, it's single glazed, so there is a kind of technological return in respect to the model that Belusky had synthesized in the Equitable. Here you can see that there are coal bridges everywhere, and that actually is a detail of a designer. It has nothing to do with the sophisticated technology that was already available at the time. And then, 1960, Pepsi Cola, Skidmore, Owings and Merrill. Again, this is almost like the solid, reliable curtain wall, now fully explored and verified and perfected, also on the same central street. in Manhattan. Meanwhile, there are other things that are happening. The Cold War, the war has finished. The Cold War is starting. There are a number of political processes and issues, I think, of representation that are triggered by the Cold War. There are also the technology of the curtain wall is now firmly established and moves from almost like an artisanal craft to a system that is already unitized and for example, and is now being exported again away from Manhattan. The system is growing in the post-war. The economy is going very well, and this is IBM, 1956, Saarinen, who actually takes those technologies that had been synthesized in Manhattan and makes them suburban, doing interesting things that have to do with, for example, the use of EPDM gaskets. Gaskets, instead of using silicon joints, which is what was used before in the previous typologies. He takes this element from the car industry, which is a rubber gasket, and makes it into the. That is the detail of the EPDM gaskets that he uses for General Motors, Bell Labs, and all these buildings that, as you can see, also have a different feel to those early curtain walls. They are no longer transparent. And I don't know whether we need to make or we should make hypotheses or connections about the race of the corporate world, the race of a certain expression of the curtain wall that was not part of that idea of transparency that emerged in Germany and in Europe, and then was also explored by the previous iterations in Manhattan. But it started producing buildings like this, which you probably know is the headquarters of the NSA, built in '68 in Maryland. So you see now the buildings have become monolithic, solid, no longer transparent. And what happens after this, and in parallel with the development of large corporations, is that they there are other things happening also. There is the '73 oil crisis. There is the realization that curtain walls are somehow inefficient. They need to be protected. They need to develop protection from the sun. And this is one of the attempts to do it. The John Hancock building in Boston, which as some of you may know, had enormous problems, and basically it was called at some point the plywood palace, because basically all the double glazing broke and fell down and had to be entirely replaced, and it was replaced not with double glazing but with single glazing, because everybody got suddenly scared of the double glazing, which was a measure that was popular in order to address the new energy situation in the country, but that indeed in this case, because of some technical reason of the rigidity of the way in which these double glazing units were assembled, failed miserably and set back the industry for 15 years. So more of these single glazed buildings kept being produced because people were simply scared of the double glazing. So imagine the impact that this had in terms of energy consumption from a whole generation of buildings built after after this one. And the other thing that you see in this new iteration of new generation of curtain walls is that the mullions start to be inside rather than outside. If you remember Mies van der Rohe, Skidmore, Owens and Merrill, they make a big point of showing the mullions out of the glass, which is actually not very effective, technically speaking. But they needed to do it because it was also about showing this idea of industrial production, repetition, profiling of aluminum or steel. What happens now with this kind of development of the corporate economy in the 60s and the 70s is that the mullions are swallowed by the facade. They go inside, and the buildings suddenly become monolithic, corporate. I think that there is a strange situation here where those technologies start to also intersect with a certain type of representation. Allied Bank, again, Paycop, Fried, 89, and so 89, and then there are all these things that are happening. There is a certain crisis of the corporate world, and there is also the development of clientele or an audience that is no longer interested in the corporate, in the idea of belonging to these large bodies of production or consumption, but on the contrary, there is a clientele, there is a population that is interested in the idea of customization and transparency. So here we see some of the more traditional representational problems being brought back into the assemblage, but inside of the technologies that make these unitized systems that now are treated in a differentiated manner. They are warped. So this is the new transparency. This is the post-corporate curtain wall that is different geometrically, different in terms of the grading of the surface. This is one of my buildings. Again, it's just one of them. You can do these things now. You have the technologies to make patterns or to make, that's Ben van Berkel, these ones here in Manhattan. Now the idea is that these technologies are used in a different way that is no longer trying to represent these things and are mobilizing. This is the mother of all post-Fordist curtain walls, the Elbe Philharmonie that is still unfinished, Herzog and de Meuron, where glasses curve, twist, are fritted in a differentiated manner, etc., etc. So that's one of these 12 typologies, and I don't know how. I'm not going to get anywhere, obviously, at this speed. But you get the idea. What I am interested in exploring is how all these political and geopolitical and economic and technical and energetic and climatic problems are embedded into these 12 assemblages that I am trying to describe here. This is another one. This is actually one that I hadn't even thought, but Rem insisted that we had to address the precast technology, and I think that maybe he was right. This is an assemblage that is all about sinning and trying to redeem the technology. I think, as I said, every one of these assemblages has a certain micro history that I am trying to explain. This is maybe some of you know is the door. It's actually not the door of the AA, but is one of these doors, and these are. This is the first the first type of precast concrete that ever existed. And it was done in 1770 by a woman and her daughter who had a factory in London. She was, her name was Eleanor Coade, and she was famous for inventing something that was called the code, or the coad, I don't know how to pronounce it, stone. And many of these buildings were using those stones as a kind of decorative motif. So this is where I think that this assemblage is cursed from the very beginning, because it attacks something that is sometimes holy, which is the stone. We to treat the stone is something that deserves a certain respect, and here we see the stone being milled and destroyed and reconstituted to produce ornament. That is how problematic this was. I mean, this was also done by the same stone. She was incredibly, phenomenally successful, and so here we see that actually precast concrete, which is something that we all associate immediately to Khrushchev and systems of mass production and repetition, etc., was actually generated as an ornamental, as something that was able to produce ornament and sculpture and art. Again, we have some sort of conceptual beginning. 1906, John Alexander Brodie, an engineer in Liverpool, makes the first prefabricated housing and some other things using precast concrete. Then we move on to two people, again, Europe and America, using this technology in a very ornamental manner. This is Gustave Perret, Notre-Dame du Raincy, a church that he built where he used the fact that he could cast concrete in order to produce this very elaborate vitrail with glass. He did also more programmatic things later on, but I think what I was interested here is in seeing Notre-Dame du Raincy that was built in 1922 compared to a number of houses that Frank Lloyd Wright did between 23 and 26 in California, using what he called textile blocks. This is the Freeman House, for example, but you see that what motivates the whole use of precast concrete is the fact that you can produce a motif, a repetitive motif that then generates an ornamental surface. In this case, being used also as a scaffolding system for the structure, so it starts having also a more constructive purpose. Le Corbusier, Pavilion Suisse, 1930, and then I think a very interesting use of precast concrete in Tokyo, in the Musée the National Museum of Western Art in Tokyo, where he developed this precast concrete using pebbles, almost as if it was a Japanese garden embedded in the concrete. So but basically Le Corbusier used the precast now in a more programmatic way, almost like saying, why should we use natural stone if we can use this thing and we can play with pebbles and other things. And then we get to the point that is probably most or better known, which is the Russian experience. 1929, Ernst May is called to Moscow to develop the next 5-year plan at that point, Khrushchev is not yet the leader of the party, but is very engaged with all these processes of trying to build the country, trying to build the houses for the new proletarians, and so then he becomes the leader and leaves the problem of industrializing what was called the Khrushchevkas, the K7 units that you can see below, these blocks of prefabricated. This is Khrushchev with Nixon, very interested in the problem of housing. He will be, in this case, a hero in this chapter. And these are the Khrushchevkas that were built in the post-war and even exported to some of the allies, to the Russian to the Russians in Cuba and in other places, where there are Khrushchev basically forbid, and this is perhaps the first deliberate example of redeeming this material and taking out the precast concrete from this kind of ornamental beginning, artistic beginning that it had, and turning it into associating it to social processes, processes of political change. He has really an incredible discourse that where he forbid the use of precast concrete for ornamental purposes. There are, you can see some images. Unfortunately, I didn't have any with me now, but where precast concrete was being utilized in Russia or in the Soviet Union in order to produce ornamental patterns of the facade of buildings. He completely forbid them, probably send a few people to the Gulag for being ornamental, and forbid also craftsmen. So these guys that you see in the picture installing one of these K7 panels were technicians, and so he is obviously successful at doing this, although the whole process eventually fails, and so this is where I think in the history of this assemblage is almost a repetition of attempts to redeem this material and to associate it to social processes, but eventually they all collapse, and you will see. I mean, this is the next guy that tries to redeem or use precast concrete on a large scale for social purposes. Is George Romney, the father of Mitt Romney, who was at some point the director of the. He was the CEO of American Motors, and then he became involved in politics and became the head of the HUD for a while, and developed a whole plant, whole operation breakthrough, which was destined to increase the amount of housing available for the poor. Under the Nixon administration, he was eventually fired because Nixon realized that he was actually moving these people to the city, and they were stopping to vote. Basically, he was attacking his constituency by housing these people. So that is, but at the same time, he had moderate success in developing the technology of precast construction in the US. In the UK, same situation. Big promise, precast concrete being sold as the solution to the housing of the poor, or maybe the housing of the workers. But then 1968, Ronan point, one of these precast concrete blocks collapses because of an explosion, and that is in the UK identified as the moment in which everybody stops doing precast. Precast becomes a technology that should not be used any longer. So it is interesting that before this failure, systematic failure of the American, the British, and the Russian experiments with precast concrete, there is in parallel certain developments. Marcel Breuer, who is obviously not such a programmatic architect. This is UNESCO, done with egg-crate construction panels, Pirelli, Le Corbusier. So you see that finally, in parallel, this is 58, again, before this collapse of the dream of redeeming concrete, there are a number of experiments, Sydney Opera House, using precast concrete panels, but much more for artistic purposes. So they are big buildings, but in a way, a return of these technologies to the origin of the assemblage into a more sort of artistic and plastic device. This is Marcel Breuer in Turin Corporation factory in Neville in Belgium. This is Gordon Bunshaft, who is again somebody who, after mastering repetitive precast concrete in the American Can Corporation, does the Beinecke library in Yale, which is using this very complex and formally sophisticated structure on the skin of the building. The bank, Lambert, on the lower corner of the building, also an experiment, formal experiment of Gordon Bunshaft that before probably everybody would have identified him with orthogonal repetitive systems. They are still repetitive, but you can see both in Breuer and in him this kind of exploration that then explodes. William Pereira, the first partner of Charles Luckman. Charles Luckman is the head of Unilever, who commissions the Lever House, and as the building is being built, he resigns and goes back to architecture, because he was an architecture by training, and teams up with this guy, William Pereira, who does with him all these strange precast concrete experiments in the Transamerica Tower in San Francisco and Langson Library in UC Irvine, which and Bofill, who obviously introduces an entirely different. So you see that after the kind of attempt to redeem and to turn the precast concrete into something decent and legitimate and socially conscious, it becomes maybe socially. Probably Bofill would say that he is simply communicating with the public or something like that. But in some ways, that capacity, plastic capacity of and capacity to produce certain scale of work with a certain level of detail is incredibly sophisticatedly used here. And then more contemporary attempts to use this material that are going more and more towards its origin in this kind of artistic stance. Herzog de Meuron, Miralles Tagliabue in Scotland, and this is closer to you, Mulberry House from Shop here in Manhattan, also using some sort of strange and sophisticated concrete that is no longer concrete. Like Herzog de Meuron, doesn't look any longer like concrete either. It looks like some sort of strange printed photograph. So it doesn't get redeemed until it goes back to that idea that this assemblage is basically an artistic endeavor, and you know that is maybe something that could potentially initiate what we could do now with that material. I don't know whether it makes sense that I say I go to one more, or we can just maybe discuss it. You can see basically the kind of argument that I'm trying to construct, and I think that we've already gone through the 12 existing categories at the moment. And I mean, quite frankly, it's not as if I have a conclusion for this thing. First of all, because it's not the research is not concluded. But one of the things that puzzle me about looking at the envelopes in this fashion is whether it will in some way put us in a situation where the things that we can do, significant things that we can do as architects today, are no longer attached to immediately visible things. I mean, they are things that occur in a different way, in this entanglement of different materials that come together into the systems, and the question is whether that doesn't mean that we as architects need to start also working in a different way, perhaps thinking about new values, or thinking about some of those energy that is embedded into the materials that we work with, because those are the things that are going to become increasingly relevant in the practice. I don't know. I mean, it's one of the questions that perhaps I would like to put on the table, and I hope that I will have the opportunity to, or you will have the opportunity to see this in other iterations in the future. Thank you very much for your attention.
Questions?
Hello.
Hi.
So in a recent article on Dzine, Sam Jacob from University of Illinois Chicago quotes you in very early in his article on why architects may have to become, or architecture may have to become less architectural. He says that well, he refers to your sort of idea that the act of architecture has been reduced to a zone comprising the few hundred millimeters of a building's envelope, the building itself, mass, floor plate, program, and so on, having been defined long before in the formulas of developers' spreadsheets. And the implication seems to be that the implication is that the role of the architect is diminished in this way, and that architects have to sort of expand the role of design in order to regain the social significance. And yet you sort of frame the envelope precisely in that sort of realm of the social and historical implications. So I suppose, what would be your response to this? Is this does the architect have to change the way that we design in order to remain socially significant, or is this sort of emphasis on the envelope precisely socially response to social factors? I
think that he's probably right in saying this. The only thing that I would say this kind of research shows is that what is probably not possible is to start the project without understanding what I called at the beginning the design space of the envelope. I think that the idea that you start drawing something or envisioning something or designing something without understanding that eventually you're going to have to fit it into certain assemblages, most likely, and obviously there is a certain possibility that you may invent a new assemblage, but most likely you're going to have to fit whatever you are considering into one of these, I mean, in this case, 12 assemblages, if you are designing an envelope. And once you understand the design space, maybe then you will be actually required to do something significant with those 150 mil or 300 millimeters of materials that you need to put together. But I think it's going to be increasingly difficult to move out of that design space. And this is a design space. I mean, I was talking about the heroes and the villains of the story, new heroes and new villains in the history of architecture. But some of the I don't know whether heroes or villains, but some of the agents that have more agency here are the companies. And maybe I was going to talk now about Breathless. Breathless is about silicon and membranes and Dow Chemical and all these chemical companies that produce silicon first for planes or rubber gaskets or sizes of glazing, Dow Corning. So suddenly you realize that there are some major forces that are gravitating about these new empires that are actually producing new chemical compounds and new processes of laminating aluminum and new tolerances and you know, when the people that determine most likely what gets built are those big companies, Alcoa, Dow Chemical, GSAPP. You know, I'm not going to do advertising of these companies, but they represent an enormous inertia there that you need to take into account in order to produce it. If your purpose is to produce an actual building, if you are maybe speculating, provided that speculating like that is relevant any longer, but maybe there are certain areas of speculation that are outside the physical constitution of things in architecture. Surely there are. I think that's all I am. I'm starting to see here that there are certain limits. You know, now you design a curtain wall, they tell you that it has to have a U value no bigger than 0.26 in Switzerland if you want to get planning permission, and that limits your possibilities enormously.
Thank you.
Hi. I have a question about the methodology of the research. So you have 12 examples, and some of them are materials, some of them are techniques, and some of them, I would say, are typologies, like the airtight envelopes.
The what?
Some of them are typologies.
Like what?
Like airplanes, or you know, I think airtight envelopes are all a certain typology of travel, or you know, a certain building typology, you could almost say. So I was wondering, in a way, what the bigger premises of the research, because is it like sort of a rewriting of history of those kind of different groups, or is it about kind of a technical research of those things? It's somehow, because the categories are not so clear to me, because they seem to come from different directions. I would just like to have a kind of clearer idea why those 12 categories from the different groups.
One of the things that I'm trying to do with this research is also to try to bridge between the technical and the cultural sides of the discipline that are often disconnected. You have people who are thinking in the technology, but they're not able to understand where that technology fits into a kind of political background or economical background. And as you saw there are huge processes like the reconstruction of the war industry in Germany and in the US that generate most of the companies that today produce curtain walls, for example. Or processes that have to do with insulating buildings in order to avoid energy loss. Those aspects that are technically mediated have a crucial impact in the culture and in the politics. And this is why I'm interested in trying to see. I mean, ideally, what I would like to know is if you have a U value in your curtain wall of 0.3, what is going to happen with the Middle East? That's the kind of thinking that I hope a research like this would be able to ground. That kind of bridging between processes that perhaps are not visible but are embedded before, or not, I don't know whether before, I think it is already happening, but the traditional perception of the envelope, and this is how I started the presentation, is as if it is a problem of representation, is as if it is an interface between things. And what I'm trying to say in analyzing these cases, like when I'm trying to analyze them, is that those geopolitical processes of the war in the Middle East, or the reconstruction or the use of steel at certain moments for the war industry, and those are literally embedded in what we build. So what we build in the envelope is no longer, or the leakage factor that or the thermal transfer factor relate to climate change, relate to a number of processes that are loaded. And the architecture that we need to do now is not necessarily about representing it. We still probably have to represent it, but it's about literally embodying these processes. And the problem I find is that in some ways, if we look at architecture like this, the whole discipline as we know it almost disappears. Because before it was all about representation, now it is about a literal embodiment of those processes. And the envelope is probably the most charged element, the more complex one, the one that has more material entanglements, the one that relates with air flows and temperature flows and views, and that's why I think it's so interesting to look at it.
I guess then maybe to follow up on that, I think it's really interesting, this kind of entanglement of, I guess, industry, politics, and design. And I'm curious if there's any way, maybe it's outside of the scope of this research, but within your practice that you see architecture influencing these things. Like, for example, outside of architecture, right, Tim Cook's legacy in Apple is that he works with the supply chain so that the design of the product and then the kind of industry and politics, they're all enmeshed, and he works with that. Or I think I heard that Walmart actually has played a large role in standardizing CFLs as opposed to incandescent bulbs. And that's one way in which the practice of those within the industry are modifying the industry. The IAC building you showed by Gary, there's like the question of which came first, the curved panel or the structural silicone that adheres it. So I'm curious if for you, is there a way in which the design flows back into the practice, and are there ways to achieve that outside of just scale, outside of just like having a large project, or are there, what are the ways in which you can have this loop of industry and politics generates the resources or the constraints that allows for a design, and then vice versa, in which some attempted design creates the tools or the processes that then alter the landscape of industry?
The question here is what do you understand by design? And you said supply chain. I'm very interested in the supply chain because I think most of the relevant processes that we see happening in Apple or I've been very interested also in manufacturing industries, cheap, low-cost airplane, low-cost flights. All these processes that are having massive effects are primarily based in the supply chain, in tampering with the supply chain. And so the question is, when you say design, are you then associating design to the old models of the discipline where maybe you start playing with drawing or with geometry or with composition? Or is that design has to be revisited and rethought in order to be able to enter into those supply chains to be truly effective? And I'm personally more interested in the possibility that this analysis can redefine what is design than in trying to think in what way we can redeploy the old discipline into the new processes. But obviously it leaves us in a slightly difficult position, particularly those of us who have been educated perhaps in other tools. I'm about to, for the first time in my life, teach undergrads on the kind of very first studio, and I am thinking that maybe, if you go back to the methodologies of teaching architecture, they're basically grounded in the Bauhaus and in the kind of plastic arts and in the history of art. I mean, I think that one of the problems that this discipline has is that it's based in the history of art. And I think that needs to be slightly corrected if we want to remain relevant.
Would you see something like, instead of a history of art, like the contemporary state of the industry in like a more critical way, like that would be kind of an entrance into like what can you do with the things that exist then? Like what would you see as a kind of
I mean, obviously, this in particular, I'm not saying that you can teach these kind of things to people who are starting, because these are things that require a certain level of knowledge, but it's not only technical matters, it's also engagement with social processes. What does it mean? How can we take advantage of social media? Social media is something that I've been also working a little bit as a research. If we were able to enter with architecture into that world, we would be much more effective. The question is whether the tools that we have been educated on are adequate to enter into those supply chains or social or political processes.
Over here. Next question. in the politics of the envelope, you set up a system of classification that's volumetric, and it indicates a relationship between program and envelope in that somehow. And I'm wondering if this move to a classification based entirely on assemblage, does that indicate a shift in how you understand the relationship between program and envelope?
No, I think it's another side of the same problem. The same problem being that the edge of the building, the skin of the building, is, I think, the most important area for the practice of architecture today. I think there were other moments in which program was super important and super interesting, because actually architects could rethink how to organize a building. Or the structure was very interesting because there were new possibilities or mechanical services at some point were also interesting. I think that now the place where you have more possibilities to affect the culture and the politics and the world lies in the envelope, simply because you are not able to design programs any longer. Housing is done in a certain way, and most likely, I mean, I think that maybe there is a possibility that one guy, not just in this school, but in all the schools in the U.S. in 20 years would introduce a slight modification of the housing typology, but it's very unlikely. So I don't know whether it's worth putting your eggs in the basket of trying to redefine how people live or how people work. And one of the reasons why this happens is that we live in a globalized world. The processes are increasingly large in scale. You are designing an office building, and that office building should be able to be used by a guy who has been, or a girl who has been educated in Japan and comes to work in New York. Because that's the whole nature of the game today. If you do something that deviates enormously, it's as if you design a car that you cannot, that you don't understand how to operate. So you go to the car rental, which is a situation that is increasingly also frequent, as opposed to owning your own special car, and you need to be able to just know how to operate in that. So the programs, I think, are difficult to modify. The kind of modification that you can do are very small. The structure also, I mean, what are you going to invent as a structural engineer now? Nothing. Everything is invented, more or less. Somebody may do something with Kevlar soon, but again, it's a very minor field. So this is why I'm interested, because I think here there is still a lot of freedom, and there is a very direct engagement. People have seen traditionally the envelope as a problem of representation, but I think it's a locus where there is an embodiment, a literal embodiment of many of the processes that concern us. The environment, the climate, the energy, all this stuff.
Hello. Just maybe mine is the last. Hello. I have a question that interestingly relates to what you just mentioned about structure, and I'm wondering, is there maybe one more category that you could add to your 12 that has to do with structure itself? And it seems to me that all the systems are more or less hang from the slab or the mullions, or they're attached to them. But I could think of the category of the what's so-called exoskeleton facades, where the structure itself becomes part of the expression of the facade. And I'm not knowing the whole history, but I would briefly think of Stephen Hall's MIT the MIT dormitories or the linked hybrid, where he clearly uses the exoskeleton, and I'm wondering, could that be a different category?
I don't think that those buildings use any exoskeleton.
It is. Or generally talking about the idea that maybe structure itself is the part of the facade. It is exposed, and it is part of the system.
I mean, as I said at the very beginning, I'm not even sure that these are the right 12 categories. And if we had gone on, then we would have been questioning where are the borders between the face seal and the rain screen, for example, or other. So there's a kind of gray area between some of these categories that is interesting, and I didn't have time to explain. So I'm not in any way saying these are the 12 final ones. It may be that next time that Mark will not invite me, but maybe hopefully somebody else will invite me in 5 years, and there will be 6 or 15. So it is an ongoing process. But I think, you know, the other thing that I said at some point is that I'm interested in technologies of the most. And there were several technologies that I ignored. For example, the precast at some point I ignored because I didn't see it evolving very fast now. I thought it had it's almost like you see these things like exploding at some point because there is the reconstruction of the war industry or climate change concerns, Kyoto Protocol, etc., and some of these things are latent. For example, there's something called AVES, external insulation systems, which were developed in Germany after the war for the reconstruction. They're basically styrofoam with some sort of finish. And they were barely used when they were invented. And at some point here in the US, people discovered that with these AVES you could do all kinds of colors and shapes. And most of the postmodern architecture, like the Portland building, the famous Portland building that's clad with AVES, for example. That's this kind of materials. It exploded. I think that like 12% of the buildings in the US were made with, of the commercial buildings in the US were clad with AVES. Those are the moments when the ecology of the assemblage clicks, and then it may disappear like species. They are latent until something makes them predominant, and then they decay. And the exoskeleton is something that at some point probably was more interesting to architects, and I don't think that now it is. And you know why it's not? Because exoskeletons produce cold bridges, and cold bridges are not. I mean, you can solve it. You can do things so that you mitigate the cold bridge that you produce when you have an exoskeleton. But normally in this political climate, you want to have the cladding outside of everything, so that you have less cold bridges, so you consume less energy. And that's why probably that is not one of the species that I selected as relevant now.
Thank you.
You want to make the last question?
This morning we had a talk in this room about it's actually the manufacturer Hanover Trust at 5th and 43rd by SOM. And
the Manufacturers Trust.
Yeah.
Oh,
so
I had it later on.
The guy who renovated the building was saying that the intent of the design was that the glass disappeared, and the way this was achieved was that providing more lighting inside the building than on the exterior. So I think it made a very interesting point about the fact that we really we want to be protected from the outside, but really want to be as outside as possible. And I think, so first I want to thank you because it was extremely interesting and helpful, this kind of encyclopedic reviews of all the sort of architectural trends, like extremely comprehensive. And I think that facades play a huge role in, for instance, like putting forward the idea that there's a difference between man and nature among like all human heads, maybe. And what I see in all the trends that you've noted is that more and more we try to kind of like, well, first, urbanism creates buildings that are like mountains, that are extremely monolithic and impermeable, and more we try to, like, as we're facing the problem of density, we're facing the problem of climate change and of pollution, we try to like provide different kinds of answers for like this relationship between the fact that we want to be protected as much as possible in our buildings, but that we are kind of killing all the things that we want to be protected from, or that we are becoming our worst enemies.
Let me ask you a question related to the thing of the manufacturer's trust. The manufacturer's trust is a building that was built at a certain moment when energy was cheap, etc., and that's why it's so transparent. And I think, but I'm not entirely sure, I think it's single glazed. I don't know whether in the reconstruction they put a double glazing, but I think it may be single glazed. And the category in which it is related to the fact that it was designed, the lighting design of that building was made by a guy called David Kelly that you may have heard of. It was a guy who designed the interior lighting for many of the buildings in Seagram and all the buildings along Park Avenue were designed by David Kelly. Now, one of the interesting questions is whether transparency is politically correct, even, or is affordable. You have on one side the Apple shop, which is the epitome of the contemporary branding exercise and shop, and is the complete absence of, is what is called in this exercise all glass or total vision envelopes, and it has its own lineage and tradition and technologies, and goes between maybe the Koenig house or the neutral houses, and the fact that you have how do you call it? Not plate glass, float glass, exactly. Float glass generates the possibility of having a very transparent glass. And what you see now when you design a building with shops on the ground, for example, I mean, I don't know, here in the UK, if you design a building with shops in the ground, your client wants the shop windows to have single glazed. And the planners want the shop windows to have double glazed. And so you have to do all kinds of exercises between the idea of making things as transparent as possible, but also you need to comply with certain regulations. And so those games, which are very specific, and you can measure them, and you can think about them specifically, are where we architects engage with contemporary politics.
But my question actually was, I guess, on the same realm of dealing maybe with politics, because what I see in this is that it's extremely limited to architecture in like.
The question
is so that because it's like in a like grammatical way, so you're really focused on the facade, but rather that we should rather review our model of urbanism, so that doesn't create these buildings that are like mountains and need these like, you know, vertical or like very like anti like against the ecology and against like that need to
You
be.
just had so many chances to ask the last question. It's like you don't want to ask the last question, which is so. But I think, if I understand you right, it's like you're interested in maybe even people who are hearing the lecture in terms of the relationship between the envelope and the inside of the building, and you're talking about that the other way around, the city and all of this. I think for me, of course, this is a lecture that it's only at number 3, so will be finished sometime in 3 days. And by 3 days, he will have changed his mind on the categories. But I think for me, it's a very important lecture. I think it was really nice to hear the beginning of this layer of research onto the previous layer. But when you show the drawings of the mullions, standard mullions of the 1950s and so on, I think the simple observation that's very important is those drawings are more complex than any of the drawings of the buildings in which those mullions were. In fact, more complex than any buildings on the planet. So any mullion is more sophisticated geometrically. Before we talk about performance, just shape, like the thing that we are supposed to be good at. There's more of it. So there's more of the old idea of shape, of form, and so on, hidden inside these small details than in the rest of the building, which is why possibly the species of architect is the one who might disappear. Right? But interestingly, the field of architecture has been driven for a long time by stories of its imminent demise. Right? So you look at all these figures like Le Corbusier and the others, they thought that architecture was finished. Really finished. And the main argument of modern architecture was we have to catch up to 1850. We have to actually try to catch up to 75 years before. So species can be driven by a sense that they're about to die. So I think what's great about Alejandro is sort of the grim reaper. You should stand here like this and give this lecture on the envelope. It was great. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Very helpful.